Hello. Hello, everybody. I think I can edit this afterwards. Let me make sure everything is up and going. Looks like it. Hello, everyone. I'm just posting the links. Posting the link on the Facebook group on Flamenco Studies. Then I'm going to start reading. If you stop by, be sure to comment and say hello. Oh, is this thing glitched? Nope. No, it's not glitched. I was just sitting very still there for a second. This is my first live stream here on YouTube, so I'm gonna get the hang of it. Hello to anybody watching. All right. So I think I'm all set up and good to go here. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to edit all this out, this beginning part, in the YouTube studio. So this live stream, as the title shows, it is about this Ductor historicus, which I think means like guide to history in Latin. The full title is much longer. A short system of universal history and an introduction to the study of that science, containing a chronology of the most celebrated persons and actions from the creation to this time, a compendious history of transactions of the ancient monarchies and governments of the world, an account of the writings of the most noted historians, together with definitions and explications of terms used in history and chronology, and general instructions for the reading of history, partly translated from the French of M. de Vallemont, but chiefly composed anew by W.J. M.A. So it's quite a lengthy book, but I am just going to focus on chapter 2 in this video, the grounds of chronology. So here I have chapter 2 up, and what I'm going to be doing is reading the passages and then also commenting on them as I go along. So chapter 2 is this book, actually, before I get started, was published in 1689, 98. Yep, 1698. So just about the turn of the 17th century into the 18th century, which is about the time that the chronology was starting. People were taking more of an interest in chronology. There was a more scientific approach to it. People wanted to pin down what exactly happened in the past. And so here is chapter 2 of Ductor historicus. Although chronologers do very much disagree in their opinions, yet there is an art and certain rules for the placing in order, the succession of times and epochs, and this marshalling of events which we observe in their books is always grounded upon some reason or other. They all have the same guides, but because every man follows them after his own way, it is not to be wondered if the minds of men, being so different in their nature, seldom agree upon the same subject. And clearly this is the opening statement of chapter 2, where he is commenting on how the chronologers disagree often and seldom agree upon the same subject. So it goes into it a little bit more on some of those disagreements, but first he lays down the 3 principles of the certainty of chronology. So the certainty of chronology depends upon 3 principles. The first is the testimony of writers or authors. The second is grounded upon astronomical observations, and particularly upon the eclipses of the sun and moon. The third is taken out of certain epochs so constant and evident in history that it never came into any man's thoughts to call them in question. So, the certainty of chronology, just to quick summarize that, is based off of written testimony or authors. The second is based upon astronomical sciences, which is spherical trigonometry, which you have to use to predict eclipses of the sun and the moon. And the reason why those are so important is that they help pin down when certain events happened in the past, which also is problematic to a degree. I think it gets into that later on, but basically the planetary motions used to believe to be constant, but now they're believed to shift and change throughout time, which is where we're at with our current system here with NASA and ESA. They both have their equations. Their calculations are based on the validity of the historical sources, and so they have math molded to fit the historical narrative as opposed to doing it through a constant motion. There's other things that are brought up, like I think tidal friction and other sorts of claims that affect the way that these planets move. So like the speed of the moon around the Earth, it slows down or speeds up depending on different factors. So then this chapter goes into 3 sections. So this symbol right here is for section, and this is section 1, the testimony of authors. The testimony of authors is so universally received among all civilized nations that it would be a breach of good manners to question the certainty of some facts which are mentioned in history. Alright, so that almost kind of goes on the third certainty of chronology that he brings up that I accidentally just glossed over. It's that some things from these epics are so evident that nobody has ever questioned them. You're not supposed to question them. They're definitely true. It's somewhat of a doctrine, almost like I think nowadays people are more open to questioning some of these things, but back then in this person's time and place, questioning was not allowed as much. And then right off the bat into the testimony of authors, he says about questioning the certainty of some facts which are mentioned in history, that it would be a breach of good manners to ask questions about those. So you don't want to have bad manners and start questioning things. You gotta just respect that these people have claimed these things and no questions are to be asked. So in these live streams, I am going to do my best to check the live chat, and I'm not sure how to say this person's name, Kailasa, but they commented saying that the stars map of time is my favorite. That's what the Hindus use to map their chronology. And so, according to this commenter, the Hindus use the star map. I think stars map. I'm not sure what that is. If you have a link to that, be sure to comment it so that people can check that out, or comment some way for people to find out more about that. So to continue, it would be a breach of good manners to question the certainty of some facts. And then he goes on to try and paint the picture of how absurd it would look for somebody to question things. How would that man be looked upon in the world that should dare to maintain that Xerxes never came into Greece, that Rome was not taken by the Gauls, and that Julius Caesar was not stabbed in the Senate house? And then he's quoting St. Augustine here. Although I have not seen Rome with my own eyes, and never was at Constantinople, yet upon the credit of those that speak of it, I hold it for as great a certainty that there is such a city as Constantinople, as there is such a city as Rome. And then Hearne gives the citation for that, book 13. However, there are rules which a man must take along with him to avoid the danger of embracing errors instead of truth, and 'twere against reason to believe upon trust and without examination what we are told to have happened a great many ages before. The late Dr. de Lannoy, or Mr. de Lannoy, a doctor of Nevers, and so famous by many critical works upon several passages of church history, has given us 4 rules, or sure precepts, to discern truth from falsehood, and matters related by historians, which are these. And de Lannoy it's the first name on this list of people who question or questioned history. The article on my website that you can find it. He is a French theologian known as the Tumbler of Saints or the Displacer of Saints, because he went to show that a number of venerated saints didn't actually exist, that they were just fabrications of other people. They were fantasies, pure fantasies. So he mentions him and goes off of his 4 rules to discern truth from falsehood. So before I get into those, the commenter has commented again saying, I mean the timing of alignment of stars and dates of eclipses. So it would be interesting to look into some of the Indian star maps, or the timing of eclipses, and to read about that, because from what I have read so far, it seems like their chronology is somewhat chaotic. Rule 1 from De Lannoy. In matters belonging to history and tradition, whose authors are chiefly to be credited who wrote of things transacted in their own time, provided they are not contradicted by a contemporary author of known integrity and ability. So Rule 1 is basically, if we have the record of somebody that lived during the time of the event, that record is to be the most reliable record about that event, unless they're contradicted by somebody that's credited with being even more reliable during their own time. So Rule 2 is, next to contemporary authors, those writers who lived nearest the age wherein the things were transacted are rather to be depended on than those who are more remote from it. So after the first rule, the best that you can get is somebody that was actually there and witnessed the event taking place. The second best that you can get is the people that weren't around at the time of the event, but as closer to the event than anybody else that we know of. So just one removed from that. So Rule 3 is Histories that look apocryphal or doubtful and are written by a new or obscure author ought to weigh nothing, especially if they clash with reason, against the constant tradition of the ancients. So doubtful histories, apocryphal histories, these are, I guess, what would seem doubtful to one person might not seem doubtful to another, and so you would, I guess that would vary a bit. Maybe you would need more guidelines on how you would determine that. Maybe if there's a story in there about a king who got coronated, that's a believable event because kings, they get crowned. But then if it went on to say that this king could walk through walls and could fly through the air without any noticeable help, then possibly that might be a bit more doubtful, as we don't see that happening every day. Or written by a new or obscure author, so the authorship matters if it's not attributed to somebody that's already recognized and it's just written by anonymous, which a lot of our records are anonymous, then that could be a bit more obscure and more unreliable. So rule 4 is we must suspect the truth of a history related by modern authors, especially when they disagree among themselves and with the ancients about several circumstances. So then this is about people around during our time that it's to suspect. I think what he's saying is being skeptical of the truth, possibly. I'm a bit confused by the wording there, but I think it's saying skeptical of modern authors, especially when they have disagreements between each other and disagreements between the old records, then that is a red flag. But maybe if he's saying that, I think that's about it. I think that's what rule 4 is. So rule 1, just to quick summarize all this, rule 1 is if we can get somebody writing about an event at the time of the event, that's as reliable as you can get. But if we don't have that, rule 2 then is to get somebody as close to the event as possible to get their opinion. Rule 3 is definitely need to be skeptical about apocryphal or doubtful histories written by new or obscure authors, so anonymous ones or people that are new to the scene that might not know exactly what they're talking about. And then rule 4 is, I think, be skeptical of the truth. Let me know what you think that one is in the comments if you have an opinion on it. So to move on, we're on to page 11 now. These rules ought to be remembered, for the studious critic will find them to be excellent guides in his journey through the dark and obscure regions of antiquity, wherein, if he makes not use of his judging faculty, he may, instead of improving, very much impair his understanding by being led astray by the false relations of ignorant pretenders to history. To these 4 rules we must add one more of St. Augustine's. As for profane authors, says he, when they relate things contrary to the history contained in the Bible, we must not believe them. For our own reason will tell us that the divine spirit, which is conspicuous in that book by the true predictions of things long before they came to pass, is certainly to be credited in the relation of matters of fact, preferably to all mankind. And so here he's quoting St. Augustine, talking about how the Bible is the best source for chronology, and that because the Holy Spirit, or the divine spirit, had predicted things to come and showed mastery over the sequence of events, that divine spirit is to be trusted more than the spirit of man. So this is more theological, and I don't really have too strong opinions on whether or not that divine spirit definitely exists, or if these, I'm personally more inclined to believe that whatever predictions there may be were written Ex Vaticanum, I think is what it's called, written after the events. So it's written, it would be like if I wrote today posing as somebody in the 1800s that predicted the coronavirus, and I was really thorough with all my descriptions, and then this letter shows up and people would think, oh, this guy from the 1800s actually predicted this. This is incredible. He really must have had a connection to that divine spirit. But possibly there is a divine spirit that prophesied these things and told people to write them down, and then they came true. But this is also another point on the origins of our modern chronology. It did start out extremely biblical, with people who believed in the Bible trying to prove the Bible and finding evidence for it. And so as we go on, where they talk about the Chinese chronology and Egyptian chronology, I think a lot of the heavy criticisms there might be influenced by the fact that they don't line up with biblical history. So then there was also this first line about the studious critic and how they, through using judgment and reason, it can help improve instead of impair the false histories and ignorant pretenders to history. So that is, again, just about being studious and studying a lot and understanding what we can know and what we can't know. So to continue on, nothing ought to weigh more with Christians than the authority of the Holy Scripture. Those bounds which the Spirit of God has set ought never to be removed by men, and therefore it is matter of just indignation to see some men of learning, who profess the true religion, set the historical fables, for I will venture to call them so, of the Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Chineses, in competition with the chronology of the Bible, a fault so much the more inexcusable on account of the notorious uncertainty of their accounts. For everybody that has studied history knows that the Chaldeans or Babylonians assigned their monarchy myriads of years, and boasted of their astronomical observations for an extravagant number of ages, and their histories are so full of lies that Aristotle reckoned among the tellers of fables those that wrote of the Assyrians. And so here is what I was just kind of mentioning. It's a really critical view of the extra biblical chronologies and histories, where I know there's still a lot of Christians in the world, but I think even a lot of the Christians today admit that it's more so a parabolistic. They talk through metaphors, and that the Bible isn't actually history, at least not the Old Testament. I think maybe the New Testament, Christians would be unwilling to waver on, or to provide some sort of leeway for, the walking on water thing. But I don't know, it would be interesting to interview people to get their opinions on how historical is the Bible, and where do we draw the lines, and on what. But for this video, at least for this live stream, I'm just talking about this guy from the late 1600s, and he is really critical of the Chinese and the Chaldeans and Egyptians, and quoting Aristotle, saying that the tellers of fables are those that wrote of the Assyrians. So to continue on, nor are the Egyptian accounts of time more to be credited, for by reason of an emulation between them and the Chaldeans for antiquity, they have had recourse to extravagant fables, and tell us that the gods and demigods reigned in Egypt for 34,201 years before that empire fell into the hands of men, and the accounts they give since that time are altogether uncertain and imperfect, for notwithstanding the care that they are said to have taken in preserving their history, science, and etc., by inscribing it on pillars and maintaining colleges of priests for its propagation, yet their history is so imperfect that even in the days of Herodotus they could give no certain account of the building of the pyramids, or the time of their great monarchs Sesostris and Plato. And Plato had declared in his Timaeus that the Egyptian priests, whom the Greeks so often consulted to know the origin of the world, were miserably ignorant of antiquity. So there are quite a few names here that I admittedly do not know exactly how to pronounce. So please excuse me if I butcher the names, because I am ignorant on how to say them. The point here, though, that he's drilling home is that the Egyptians, they really didn't know what their history was, and that it's not to be trusted because the Bible is incredibly certain, and it's a product of the divine spirit. To continue, the Chinese chronology is still less to be regarded, for not only are their histories dated many ages before the creation and full of incredible stories and extravagances, as for instance 'tis related that a certain Hazu, who lived in the time of Confucius, lay 80 years in his mother's womb. But also their chronologers differ in their accounts, for Sima Quam, a famous annalist of China who lived about the year 1066 of the Vulgar era, does not make their empire so ancient as the rest of the historians of that nation, for whereas they make it begin at Fulsi, Sima Quam places it above 250 years lower, and maintains that Huang Ti was their first king. So he's criticizing the Chinese chronology here by explaining that even they disagree amongst themselves about what their chronology is. And I don't think it's in this chapter, but maybe it's chapter 1 or the epics. But in this book, he talks about how the biblical chronologists, maybe it's a different thing I'm thinking of. I read 2 of these in the same day. There's a different book that talks about how the biblical chronologists didn't agree, and how there were over 120 different Anno Mundi dates that had been calculated to try and figure out when the world, and in the Christian doctrine, when they were calculating these, the world and man had a simultaneous creation. And so, maybe I got that wrong, but Anno Mundi means since man, or since the creation of man. And so when they're dating Anno Mundi dates, it's how many years since the creation of man. And one of these books that I read recently was talking about how there were over 120 different Anno Mundi dates that had been calculated. And so where Hearne here is criticizing these other people for not knowing their history and for disagreeing with each other, I don't think that he's in too much of a different boat, because he also disagrees with the majority of the different people that have come up with these different ideas. But I think later on it does go to show, he does comment on how it's really based on Dionysius Petavius, who is basically like the sidekick to Joseph Scaliger, who is the father of modern chronology, who practically single-handedly made chronology into a scientific discipline. Joseph Scaliger did that, and then Dionysius Petavius came along and bolstered it up a bit more, and that's what this, I think, is heavily based upon. So he continues to say, "Wherefore, though the science of the Chaldeans and Egyptians has been so famous in the world, and the wisdom of the Chinese be so much talked of nowadays, their chronology at least ought not to bear any great authority among us, and much less ought the sacred history of the Bible to be sacrificed to it." Really driving home that point that the Bible is to be trusted, these other people are not. This is to continue. "Though the chronology of the Septuagint Bible be by some preferred before the Vulgar, yet 'tis utterly irreconcilable with the antiquities of the Chaldeans and Egyptians, the former only carrying the times higher by 1,500 years than the vulgar account, whereas the latter pretend the world to be 40,000 years older, and whatever esteem the chronology of the Septuagint may have among some men, either because 'tis made use of in the martyrology of the church, or because Baronius is pleased to follow it, yet 'tis certain that the church does not prefer it to that of the Hebrew Bible, which it looks upon to be the most authentic, and a great many men famous for their piety as well as learning are of the same opinion. And so here he's commenting on the translations of the Bibles that the church favored the most, and so he's saying the Hebrew Bible was considered to be the most authentic, which, if I'm correct, I think the Hebrew Bible was the latest one to be written down, and prior to that it was through oral tradition. And I think our earliest version of this is in the 8th or 9th century AD. So it comes quite late compared to some of the other ones. The Vulgar is supposedly written, I think, in the 4th century, and the Septuagint is, I think, the Greek Bible. And I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head when that one was written. I'm more familiar with the biblical manuscript dates and not when they're believed to have been written. So, yep, he's just talking more about, and this is what I was saying, is even the Bibles themselves, they disagree with each other, where some of them they differ by over 1,000 years between the dates that are given. And that also, I have an article on my website, I'm just going to pull it up. I have some articles pulled up to talk about, but the Anno Mundi dating, I have something for that, where I've collected a number of them. I don't know if I have 120, as he says, but I do have quite a number. So this was one of the first articles I ever did, January 28th, 2019. This was in the first month of Ctruth, or Chronology Truth, as it was called back then. So these are the people who calculated the dates. We've got quite a number of names here, but these are the dates themselves. So Alfonso X dated Anno Mundi to 6,984 BC. And then the youngest date that we have is from Rabbi Lippmann, who dated it 3616 BC. So the dates of creation here differ by about 3,300 years, give or take a few here and there, which is quite a bit. And it's based off of the same document. They were all working with the same stuff, so kind of interesting to look back into that. So here we're on page 13 of Ductor historicus, and it starts out with, "'Tis true the chronology of the Septuagint is in the Roman martyrology, but it does not from thence follow that it ought to have the preference. The reason of its being there is because the church had always an esteem for what was ancient, and her greatest care being to preserve the more solid goods, such as are the articles of faith, the points of morality, and the rules of discipline. She did not much regard these trifles of chronology, but left them to be discussed by her learned disputants, provided they managed them with that admirable temper so conspicuous in St. Augustine, who says with relation to these matters, 'I had rather own my ignorance in these things than pretend to a false knowledge.'" Now, I wonder just how legitimate St. Augustine of a character is. I know it's rude, as the person that wrote this said, to question the authenticity of some of these people. Oh yeah, I mean, I have his date of birth already right here. So this is a really short article compared to some of the other ones that I've done, but I just wanted to start getting together the manuscript collection for Augustine of Hippo, who's also known as Saint Augustine. He lived in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, supposedly from 354 to 430, about those dates. I found the Oxford Libraries listed some manuscripts attributed to him, and the earliest of them is dated to the 8th century. So talking about sources and the 4 rules that I talked about at the very beginning of this video, he says that the best that we can do is to get records from the time of that person. So that would be at the latest the 5th century, early 5th century AD. But we don't have anything from that time. So then you would go to the second one, which would be the 8th century, from my brief overview of this. So this is the website that I got it from. You can check it. I accessed that on the 3rd of August. And on my count, it was about 280 manuscripts that they have listed. So here on this website, you can see these are the works that he is considered to be an author of, and it is a long list of works. But these are the manuscripts. So after the manuscript, sometimes it will tell you what it's dated to, unless it's a composite manuscript, which means that it is a collection of different writings that have been bound together. And for those, you have to actually go in and check them. So for the Christ Church manuscript 378, we can go and check it out. Here's the first fragment. It's by not Augustine. Second fragment is also not by Augustine. Third fragment, nope. 4 through 6 doesn't look like it. Maybe it won't tell us where that is at. Justinian. Oh, here we go. So fragments 14 through 15 of this manuscript, Christ Church manuscript 378, has Augustine's De Trinitate, and it is dated to the 13th century. And I think this might mean the end of the 13th century. But still, 13th century, that's quite far removed from the 5th century AD. You can go through this whole thing and check them out. So let's find the one that's dated kind of earlier. This one's dated to the... I had an 8th century date on that list that I saw. Well, here's one to the 9th century. So let's check it out and see if we can figure out if they have provenance. Nope. They just have the history of it. So provenance is the history of ownership. So it helps us understand where these manuscripts come from. Although this one is dated to the 9th century, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely from the 9th century. It could be from any time, just within when they got this into the database, just moments before it could have been created, which I'm not saying it was. I'm just saying that is a possibility. And they have no provenance information on it. So to be able to figure out where it came from, I would have to go and try and find what literature is available on the history of this manuscript right here, which probably hasn't been given much attention, just based off of the fact that they don't have any information on its ownership. But, well, here we have the resources. Sometimes this can kind of help figure out when it started to be looked at, which it looks like maybe the 19th century or the 20th century, but still, that is incredibly late. It's a sketchy record, and to look into the provenance of all of these would take a lot of people and a lot of time to dive into it. So here's one from the 9th century for Augustine. No record of ownership. It says it's from the 9th century, the first half, but the earliest date that we even have for it is a millennium later, which is in the 19th century. So Again, there would have to be a case study done for this to figure out exactly where it came from and who the owners are. But even if this is dated properly, it's still 4 centuries after when Augustine was supposedly around, which is incredibly late. So also we could possibly, I'm not going to do this right here on the stream, but he doesn't have the source for that, but we could possibly figure out which of these manuscripts would have that to even narrow it down the earliest mention that we have of that specific quote. So again, that is to admit the ignorance in these things. A lot of those manuscripts there, they are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. We kind of, like the Christ Church manuscript, I would imagine that came from the Christ Church Library. They have a lot of records coming out of there that are still preserved today. So to continue on with this, it is kind of a lengthy chapter. After all, it must be confessed that a man ought not to be too anxious or supercilious in point of chronology, because 'tis impossible to make it hang together so well as to put it beyond dispute. And that I just wonder, because he starts out by saying that there's some things that you just don't question. It's rude to question these things, but now he's saying, it's impossible to make it hang together beyond dispute. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like it's kind of contradictory internally, but maybe I'm just reading that wrong. The records of antiquity, as well as sacred and as profane, leave us too much in the dark to pretend to it. There will be still insuperable difficulties, and we shall meet with 1,000 instances wherein it will be impossible for us to know whether we be in the right or no. To prove this, we shall produce 5 very prevalent arguments. And so he goes into talk about the 5 reasons of the uncertainty of chronology, which, again, I guess maybe not all instances, but many instances is what he's saying. So possibly there isn't a contradiction there, but he is saying that a great bit of chronology is up for debate. The first reason for the uncertainty of chronology: the vast difference there is about chronology betwixt the Bible of the Septuagints and our vulgar causes such a perplexity that a man does not know which way to get out of it. The Greek Bible reckons 1,500 years more than the Hebrew and Latin Bibles, from the creation of the world to the birth of Abraham, and the misfortune is that one cannot tell on which side the error lies. Some accuse the Greek Bible of extending the times too far. Others maintain that the Jews have contracted them too much, and that their corruption of the Hebrew Bible has occasioned the same mistakes in the Latin version. This dispute is the more troublesome, as it is a hard matter to decide it. One thing, however, is certain, which is that St. Augustine lays the fault upon the Greek Bible, or rather upon those that first transcribed it from the original of Ptolemus Philadelphus, who, as he pretends, have introduced 1,500 years too many in the lives of the patriarchs. But everybody is not of St. Augustine's opinion, and the author of the Antiquity of Times Restored, with a great many more, and I think that's possibly a reference to Joseph Scaliger on his emendation of the times, and the author of the Antiquity of Times Restored, with a great many more, has very different thoughts, and speaks quite another way of the Greek Bible. So difficult it is to know which side to be for in this dispute. And so he's got a ultimatum here, trying to figure out which one is correct, the Greek or the Latin Bible, and it's I think an example of the ultimatum fallacy, where you're presented with only 2 options and no other options, where possibly both of those were wrong. I would imagine possibly you'd get murdered or at the least destroyed or injured for suggesting that back in his time in the late 1600s, that possibly the Bible isn't the true word of God, when they believed that it was divinely inspired. And maybe even today in some parts of the world you would get stomped for saying something like that. So possibly that is the only two, but maybe there are other options, that maybe the Bible isn't the fundamental source for chronology. So the second reason or argument for uncertainty of chronology is it is very difficult to compute the chronology of the Bible exactly, by reason that in the succession of the judges of the people of God and the kings of Judah and Israel, the scripture makes no difference between a growing and a complete year, whereas it is not to be imagined that a patriarch, a judge, or a king did live just 900, 100, or 60 years without any odd months and days. Wherefore, as Theophilus of Antioch wisely observes, it is impossible exactly to determine the times of the patriarchs and kings. All right. So the second part is the difficulty of figuring out when these dates actually happened, because he doesn't think that these patriarchs and kings would have lived for exactly 100 years or 900 years in one or two cases, but that there were many odd months and days incorporated in there, and so that presents an issue. I'm going to just check and see if I have Antioch Theophilus in my website for his manuscripts, because that is an important character. Theophilus of Antioch. Here we have it. So here's a quote that I have from Robert M. Grant from my second reference on page 159. The only extant manuscript of Theophilus which possesses independent value is Codex Marcianus Graecus 496, copied in the late 10th or early 11th century, in a hand which Gardhausen calls the Middle Minuscule. A note in the hand of Cardinal Bessarion reveals that the manuscript belonged to him. So, luckily, we have a bit of provenance for this only extant manuscript, which dates, so Theophilus is from the 2nd century AD. The earliest studies on him were conducted in the 19th century AD, from what I could tell, and the only extant manuscript dates to the late 10th or early 11th, so almost like 900 years later, removed from him, which is even further removed than St. Augustine. The provenance, though, this in the hand of Cardinal Bessarion, who I believe was in the 15th, maybe 16th century. Yeah, 15th century. So he owned it, supposedly. It could be a forged note in his hand, depending on who would be able to do that. But just for the sake of granting this, we can say that this manuscript was around in the 15th century if the note in the hand of Bessarion is correct. And so here we have more of the manuscripts, which is dated to the 11th and then dated, so this is the one up here, yeah. So surfaced from obscurity is the term that I use to the earliest date that we can tell for sure it existed, which is with Cardinal Bessarion. Possibly we could trace it back further than that, but again, this is a huge project that more people would need to get in on to be able to trace all these. But the rest of these are dated to the 15th, the 16th, the 17th. Here's another 16th, dated maybe 19th century. Here's the printed editions. The first one was in 1546. Then you can see that, but yeah, you can find these on the website just using the search function to look for that if you want to see it. I also have comment areas. You can leave a comment on it if you want to. If you happen to go in and you find something prior to Bessarion owning it or any of these other people, you can let me know and I can update the article to have the best information on there as possible. But yeah, again, going back to the four rules, we'd want some writer from the time of Theophilus, if not himself, to report on what he was doing, but we don't have that. We have anonymous manuscripts that the majority of them date to the 15th century, just a century before they started printing him. So, and then also he's commenting on the impossibility of exactly determining the times of the patriarchs and kings, which possibly wasn't done until the 14th, 15th century. So, to continue on, therefore, chronologers are obliged to suppose a great improbability that the years of the pedigrees of the Bible are always fully expired and complete. Now, if these years be but just begun, and the man reckons them for whole and complete ones, he will stretch out and lengthen the times. But on the contrary, if the holy writers have omitted the odd months and days of growing years, 'tis most certain that we shall shorten and contract the times, if we keep precisely to the computation of the Bible. Therefore, in matters of chronology, we must of necessity be satisfied with conjectures and probabilities upon 1,000 occasions. We must persuade ourselves once and for all that we cannot have the antiquity of the world but within a few years more or less, and ought to look upon all the projects of restoring the antiquity of times to a nice exactness and precision as foolish and chimerical. So I think what he's saying here is that it's a hopeless endeavor to try and figure out exactly when these ancient times had happened, and that it's laughable to think that you could figure that out. Even the Bible itself, there's room to, and as has been shown, that people have done this. They've either made the chronology too long or they've made it too short, and they don't actually know precisely exactly when the stuff went down. I gotta take a sip of water here real quick. So, the third issue with chronology, or the third uncertainty of chronology: the different names which the Assyrians, Egyptians, Persians, and Grecians have given to the same prince have not a contributed. There's a weird symbol there. I'm not sure what it means. Have not a something contributed to confound the ancient chronology. Three or four princes have borne the name of Assurus, says the Bishop of Mao in his Discourse upon History, although they had others besides. If a man was not told that Nebuchadnezzar, basically, I'm not going to go through all those and butcher them and then not get any of them right, but there's three different names there, and if a man was not told that they are but the same name, or the name of the same man, he could hardly believe it. Sargon is the same with Sennacherib, Ozias with Azarias, and Zedekias with Mathanias. Joachos was also called Selim. Asaradon, which is indifferently pronounced Esarhaddon or Asor-Haddon, is called Asinafar by the Kuthians, and through an uncountable diversity, Sardanapalus is called Tonos Komoleros by the Greeks. Those different names of the same person, differently pronounced by several nations according to the various idioms of their speech, must needs cause a great confusion and disorder in things and persons. This confusion is so great in the succession of the kings of Assyria that it is impossible for a man ever to be truly satisfied about it. So the third issue that arises with trying to figure out chronology is that these different people have, so one person has a bunch of different names. And if you're not careful, you might think that these people are actually different people, when in fact they are all the same person. So it's interesting to think about, if even looking back on it today, to try and figure out if there are any duplicates out there. If there are people that the majority of scholars would consider to be two separate people with two separate times and activities, were actually one and the same person. And that seems to have already been known about as a possibility in the 1600s. It's not something that I hear talked about too much, and the times that I do hear it talked about, it's usually shut down as pseudo-history. So that's the third problem, or the third uncertainty. The fourth uncertainty is that we have few memorials left of the first monarchies of the world, an infinite number of books being quite lost. If Herodotus wrote the history of the Assyrians according to his promise, it never was transmitted to us. The Greeks have writ very late, and those that have did not understand the Hebrew language, and were often miserably ignorant of the antiquities of Judea. We may say the same of the Latin historians, who being little skilled in the Greek tongue, and much less perhaps in the affairs of the Jews and the Grecians, have undoubtedly writ a great many things at a venture and very ill digested. The generality of them have studied to please the politeness and delicacy of their writings, and curious and strange stories, and have neglected the times of the events they speak of, which has cast a great mist upon history. And so on this, the fourth point, I think what he's saying is that there is a issue to be brought up with people not knowing what the histories are, this great mist or a fog clouding up the events. Basically, the dust has risen and it's not settling anytime soon, as long as we hold up these false histories as true histories. And he's attacking the Greek and the Latin historians, which is basically what the majority of our chronology today is based upon, is the Greco-Roman chronologies. And so he's critical of them. Again, this is coming from somebody who believes that the Bible is the ultimate chronology. I think this guy, Hearne, he believes in the Vulgate is the most authentic text. But he is at least commenting that there are distortions, there's confusion due to these Greek and Latin historians, the Greeks who are trying to comment on the Hebrews, that these Greek people don't know how to read or write or speak Hebrew, and then the Latin writers are trying to comment on the Greek writers, who these Latin writers can't speak Greek, and so it causes issues there. The fifth uncertainty of chronology is the eras and years being different almost in every nation has occasioned a great disorder and confusion in chronology. The Grecians computed the time from the Olympiads, and the Romans from the foundation of their city. More than that, some nations had no epochs at all, and have bethought themselves but late of using them. And among the rest, 'twas only about the year 532 that the Christians began to reckon their years from the birth of Jesus Christ. So the Olympiads, I think, are groups of 4 years of 360 days, and the Romans, I think according to Varro, he marked it at 753 BC, and so they would count from there. And then he comments that some nations had no epochs at all and just recently started thinking of using them. And so that's what I brought this up for, is it just kind of struck me as interesting, if you didn't keep track of your years or your times or your histories, how are you supposed to get that information after it's already passed and nobody knows aside from fabricating it? But these people, a lot of people in Bhutan, they don't celebrate their birthdays, and they don't know what their date of birth is or how old they are. And so I just from that, I wonder how influential that is on a person to not be able to trace the chronology of their own life. I could trace from the day of my birth, and you could fake somebody's day of birth if you forged the birth certificate, or you forged evidence. You could trick somebody into believing that they were maybe a year or two older. Maybe if they were even like 50 or 60, you could try and convince them that they were 55 or 65 or 70 or something like that. But it definitely causes some confusion. I'm trying to figure out the exact dates of events. And then he comments on how it took about 500 years for the Christians to start counting from the birth of Jesus Christ. So prior to that, I think maybe they were using the other calendar systems, Anno Mundi, or dating since the foundation of Rome, possibly on the Olympiads. I think since the original Christians were considered to be Greeks, I would imagine they would be dating based off of the Olympiads, but I'm not exactly an expert on the dating of the birth of Christ or how that is determined. So to continue on, the same difference is observable in years as in eras. In some countries, they made use of the lunar year of 354 days, and in others of the solar of 365 days, and about 6 hours. Although we suppose the historians too have regarded this difference of years, yet they could not avoid to make some mistakes in chronology. For besides that people were then ignorant of the true motion of the sun and moon, with which we are not perhaps thoroughly acquainted nowadays, let posterity be the judge. 'Tis certain that among the republics of Greece, though never so well governed and regulated, they did not agree about the beginning of the lunar year. One begun it precisely at the conjunction of the sun and moon, another 2 days after, that is, when the new moon began to be seen, and others began their year at the full moon. The several nations of the world have been no less divided about the season where the year should begin. The Hebrews, Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Persians begin it with the autumn, or fall of the leaf, the Grecians towards the summer solstice, and the Romans about the winters, the Mohammedans just at the equinox in the spring, the Indian Gentiles the first day of March, and the Arabians at the time of the sun's entering the sign of Leo. And so, with all of these different calendar systems considered, there is a bit of mathematics that has to go into figuring out which days from, say, the Arab calendar line up with the days from the Roman calendar. And you would have to try and determine that, which I think has been done on a number of occasions where they line up the different dates. So on Blair's chronological tables, that is kind of what is done. Hold on, I'm gonna pull this up real quick. Here it is. Yeah, I'll give you a depiction of an image of what this looks like. Wow. Alright, well, this is just the text. See other formats here. It's basically just here it is. The tables are all lined up next to each other so that you can see. Let me zoom in on this for you. These are the kings of Judah. You can see they count them. So here on the left side are different calendar types. This is an interesting read too. They've got the Julian period, the years of Rome, Olympiads, and before Christ. So it's definitely interesting. This is BC 750 to 701, which is, if Rome was founded in 753, then the fourth year of Rome would be right here, which is just 4 years after. So I'm sure you can figure that out. But here's the Olympiad. They are years of 4. So the 8th Olympiad is the same as the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th year of Rome, the 9th one, and so on. So there has been an effort to account for these different types of things, and then also these are the kings, of Judah, of Israel, Babylon, Assyria, Media, and etc., and so on. And so their rules are lined up and compared here. There's also variation amongst these different datings. So this isn't the end-all, say-all. The chronological table for the Empire of Assyria has changed tremendously. When I was going through this, I just published an article the other day on it. The years attributed to these rulers, they differ quite a bit. So, to continue. I think we're right here. All these things have thrown chronology into so great an obscurity that it is not in the power of the greatest skill in the world to pierce through all the dark mists which that variety of eras and years has cast over the face of history. Therefore, Varro most wisely calls uncertain, obscure, and fabulous the generality of those events related by historians to have happened before the Olympiads. So, prior to the 8th century BC, Varro believed that history was more or less completely obscure. Dionysius Halicarnassus, I might have manuscripts for him. Let me go to the website here real quick. No, I don't, but I think I do for Varro. We can check out what he's at. Yep. So the earliest ones we have for Varro from the Oxford libraries is the 15th century, and then Pierce lists 3. One isn't dated, one dates to the 11th, and the other dates to the 15th. So Varro was around in the 2nd to 1st century BC. The earliest thing that we have from him is in the 11th century. Possibly there's earlier ones than that, but this is the earliest ones that I have found so far. Again, leave a comment if you can find others that date further back. But that's like 12, 13 centuries removed from when the person supposedly existed. We'd have to figure out exactly how. This is one of the people that I don't think has ever really been questioned as to when he was actually around, but possibly he was around more recent than what is commonly believed. So Dionysius says positively in Book 1 that there is nothing certain in all that the history mentions concerning the transactions before the War of Troy. Macrobius assures us that we must not expect any certainty in Roman histories when they relate anything that happened 260 years before the foundation of Rome, and that concerning those times, writers are rather tellers of fables than historians. And so, this is foundation of Rome, 753. Go back, it's about around 1,000. So, Macrobius assures us prior to 1,000, it's mostly just fables and myths. We don't really know what the history was. Saint Justin the Martyr and Peronetico maintains that there is nothing constantly true in Greek histories before the Olympiads, and that we have no account left either by the Grecians or barbarians to inform us of what happened in those remote ages. I have dwelt so long upon this subject in order to show that in point of ancient chronology we must depend upon the accounts we find in the Holy Scripture, since we can expect nothing concerning the first times from profane historians. And here we must take notice of the wisdom of Providence, which has so well ordered things that we have light enough to make a firm concatenation of the succession of times. For where profane history fails us in the first 3,000 years of the world, we have the chronology of the Bible to guide us. And when afterwards we find the accounts of time more obscure in the Holy Scriptures, we meet, in requital, with more light in the writings of profane authors. and there begins the time which Varro calls historical, because since the Olympiads, the truth of things begins to be conspicuous in history, so that before that time we must enlighten profane history by the help of the sacred, and not pretend to correct the chronology of the Hebrew Bible and our vulgar by the antiquities of the Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Chinese, which is a plain and visible overturning of the order of things, and no better than to give a blind guide to one that sees well. So, again, he's really driving it home that the Bible is to be relied upon, and you cannot trust the extra-biblical Chaldeans or Egyptians or Chinese, because they're plainly and visibly overturning the true chronology. By all I have said, I do not mean to confute the book of the antiquities of times restored. My only design is to caution young people, for whom particularly I write, against a certain spirit of curiosity which has been predominant among us for some years past, and whose stirring character is too apt to remove those bounds which we ought to preserve with great veneration. As for the rest, I both honor and esteem the merit of the author, and I am very far from having any thoughts to offend him. So I think he mentions Batavia's by name later on. I wonder if he's purposefully, I think he is talking about Joseph Scaliger here, and I wonder if he's purposely leaving out his name so that people only on the in know exactly what he's talking about. And he says he doesn't want to offend him, but he does disagree, and he's cautioning young people against being curious about history. Which is just, I think that definitely having a spirit of curiosity is a good thing, because really if you're not curious, you're not going to pull on the thread, and you're not going to figure out new things. You can figure out what other people have said, but there's not much you can do. I mean, even without that curiosity, you wouldn't even want to go and figure out what other people have said, because it's already been said and done, and it's good. So that's section 1 of chapter 2. That is about the testimony of authors. And again, just these 4 rules. They're decent rules. I like the first 2, yes, you want to get testimonies from time periods that the events took place in, and if you can't have those, then the next best thing is the people closest to when the events took place. And then figuring out which histories are doubtful or written. I think Lanois also had a thing that if there was no writing or any mention of somebody prior to like 200 years, so say somebody lived in 500 AD, if there's no mention of him prior to 700 AD, then chances are he's a fake and we don't know about him. But I don't think that's always going to be the case, but still, it's something to keep in mind, just thinking chronologically about where these sources come from and how do we really know about these people in the past, and why are the popular opinions the way that they are. So to continue on, this is section 2 of chapter 2. From what I have said about the uncertainty of chronology, section 2 is the eclipses and aspects of the planets. From what I have said about the uncertainty of chronology, some perhaps will be apt to think that the doctrine of times does not deserve our application, and that we must take out of history as much as we can without troubling ourselves with a nice marshalling of the events according to the order and succession of ages, since, after all, this order is very doubtful and uncertain. I know very well that there are those who will give their skepticism a free scope upon this matter, and if their opinion could prevail, ancient history would be in little or no esteem. But it is not fit to depend upon the judgment of those who never studied things but superficially, and whose merit wholly consists in a pragmatical, peremptory way of delivering their opinions. For if there be doubtful and obscure things in chronology, there are also those that are undeniably certain and evident. And he gets into those later on, but this is, I don't know if that would technically make ancient history have little or no esteem. Possibly it would impact the way that people think about how certain and evident some of these events are, but I think a healthy level of skepticism is good to have. And I just don't think that it's very popular. I think that people enjoy the feeling of certainty more than they do of the possibility that maybe they're wrong. And really, that's just a matter of teaching somebody or believing something prior to it really being confirmed, and so they believe in something that's not supported. But yeah, to continue, there are two books in the world, both divine ones, from whence chronology draws its certainty. The first is the book of Scripture, where we find the years of the patriarchs, judges, kings, and princes of the people of God, whereby we are able to determine within a small matter of the antiquity of the world, and link almost together the whole succession of times, except some few breaks and interruptions, which proceed from the silence of the Scripture, and which we shall mark in the following article. But where Scripture fails us, profane history comes in to our help, so that we can precisely tell how long that silence has lasted. The other book, which is our second sure ground for chronology, is that of nature. This, as well as the first, is the work of God. And so, basically what he's saying is there's two books, both divine, and they are what chronology is based upon. The first is the Bible, and the second is not what any of us would call a book today, is nature. And so, going out and looking at the trees and watching the birds or the dogs play or something, that would be the second book, which is divine and which God made, and we can figure out for sure that chronology is certain through that. So here, I think he goes in to talk about the eclipses finally, but again, I think he says earlier that there's thousands of events which are still up for dispute. They're still being debated, but these undeniably uncertain ones, he has a list here at the end of 29 of these fundamental points that most chronologists agree upon. To continue on with section 2 though, 1. This book, by furnishing us with the motions and aspects of the sun and moon and other planets, and above all the eclipses, which are so rightly called the public, celestial, and infallible characters of times, gives certain and demonstrable arguments to chronologers of the times wherein a vast number of the most signal events of history did happen. For an eclipse either of the sun or moon is such a characteristical and identical mark of a year that it is easy to distinguish it among an infinite number of others, which makes eclipses to be looked upon as the most assured grounds of chronology. Certainly, nothing can so well characterize the year of a battle, or the foundation of a city, or the death of a prince, as an eclipse that happens the same day or some days before or after, since by means of astronomical tables it is found that an eclipse seen upon such or such a day ought necessarily to have happened in such and such a year. This method is grounded upon mathematical demonstrations, which is as much as if I had said that it is so certain and evident that human reason can never revolt against it. This is pretty well known about eclipses, but prior to really just within the last, I think, 50 years or so, they hadn't calculated the mathematics to allow these historical eclipses to be attributed and considered real. So like the 3 eclipses of Thucydides, there's now mathematical calculations that allow you to know for sure, yeah, those happened, and you can see it. And I use my phone as a webcam, or I'd pull it up, but I have apps on there that are based off of NASA and ESA, and they show you what the sky looked like at the time that these events took place. And those are not based off of what our previous understanding of the sun and the moon and the other planets were, but now they're based off of the validity of the history. And so one issue that chronologers or astronomers had encountered was that the further back in time you went calculating these eclipse dates, the more widely and varied and far off from the actual date of the eclipses the historical records were. So say there was an eclipse that happened that's reported to have happened in 500 BC, the way that they would calculate when these eclipses took place would have said that there's no way that eclipse could have taken place then. And so now they're based around the validity of that, and they have mathematics to substantiate that, but it's based on the idea that the record is correct and not that it's been misdated. By this, here we are. So by this it appears that in point of chronology a man cannot be an exact critic if he be ignorant of the use of astronomical tables for the calculations of eclipses, which is what I just kind of explained. Astronomical tables for calculating eclipses, they definitely didn't have it. Well, maybe they did have it figured out back then. If we don't have it figured out now the opinion is that the speeds change and that it's not constant, and that we can use historical records to figure out when these changes occurred. But back then they were constant, and we could use them to figure out when events of the past took place. Setting aside that this computation of eclipses is one of the greatest and most wonderful effects of the reach of human understanding, and that there is an extraordinary satisfaction in foretelling an eclipse, together with its greatness and duration, 50, nay, even 1,000 years before it happens, methinks the great use they are of in history and chronology is sufficient to recommend astronomy to us, by whose help we arrive at the pleasure of calculating them to a very nice precision. And therefore we must conclude that none but the dull and ignorant despisers of all good literature can entertain an indifference for so fine and important a knowledge. Now, since the certainty which eclipses give to history is infallible, we must account ourselves happy for the care historians have taken to mention so great a number of them. 'Tis true their diligence as to this matter is particularly owing to the foolish error of the ancient heathens, who looked upon these phenomena as presages of the death of some great person or the fall of an empire. However, when historians have marked the days wherein eclipses did happen, they have left at the same time assured signs and characters to know the years of the events which fell out about the same time. This is the reason why the eclipses mentioned by historians have been so carefully collected by skillful chronologers. So again, what he's saying there is that the eclipses allow us to date when these things happened, because through the astronomical tables we can look back and see when this eclipse could have happened. And eclipses, there's eclipses every year, but they can only happen in certain areas in those certain years. So every single year, the same place, I'm in Michigan, every single year we're not going to get solar eclipses that we can view from Michigan. That's only going to happen every so often. So let me just take another quick sip of water here. Calvisius makes his chronology depend upon 127 eclipses of the moon and 144 of the sun, which he assures us he has calculated himself. Thus, by an eclipse of the sun, mentioned by Justin, which happened when Agathocles, the tyrant of Sicily, was crossing the sea to go over into Africa against the Carthaginians, it is found by an astronomical calculation that this was in the year of the world 3634, and 316 years before the Vulgar era, on the 15th of August. And so I think what he's saying here is that this date has been collected strictly from astronomical calculation, and not because of anything written down or transmitted through literature. So, 2. the great conjunction of the two superior planets, Saturn and Jupiter, whereby these two stars, having run through all the four trigons, meet again, according to Kepler, at the end of 800 years. And the same degree of the zodiac would be also one of the most excellent methods distinguish and characterize the times, if historians had taken notice of those rare and unfrequent aspects. Archbishop Usher tells us that in the year of the world 3998, 2 years before the birth of our Savior, there was a great conjunction of those planets, such as never happens but once in 800 years. There have been but 8 of these great conjunctions since the creation of the world. And, alright, so Archbishop Usher is famous for his calculation of Anno Domini, or Anno Mundi dating, figuring out when the world was created. And I think it was 4004 BC was the date that he came up with. But yeah, 4004 BC I think is it. And he says that these things happen once every 800 years. So 4,000 years after the creation of the world would be 5 times, I think. What am I doing here? 4,000 years. They happen every 8 years. I think that would be 5 times. So then it would be 3 more times since then when this had been written, which possibly I think is correct. So yeah. The last of them happened in the beginning of this century in the month of December 1603. So the third point on this second part is all the aspects of the planets which happen but seldom might serve also for natural characters to mark the times. Yep, that is talking about using planetary positions to try and figure out when the dates could have been when there. If I were to look up at the sky tonight, there would be planets that I would be able to see, and I would only be able to see them in that order every so often. The fourth point of section 2 is, but among these natural characters some are called civil or artificial, because invented by men, such as the solar and lunar cycles, the Roman indictions, Easter, the leap year, among the Jews, the jubilees and sabbatical years, and among the heathens, the combats and public games, such as the Olympic, which were always celebrated in a determined time. Which is talking about the marks that we come up with ourselves as humans. So the third section, and we're almost done here. Before we get to that, I forgot I was going to go over this just briefly when I was talking about mentioning how the Egyptians didn't know their ancient history and trying to determine what actually happened there. I made this article a while back. I published it on March 6, 2019. My last update was on May 28th, 2020. Here's my list. It's a lot of statistics, a lot of data. These are all the websites that I took info from, basically just to compare different dates that are given to the Egyptian timelines. So the oldest one varies the most, where I got 25 entries out of the 30 that I found info from. The oldest start date was 8000 BC. I think that's from that's a reputable college, I'm pretty sure, maybe Oxford. It's from one of their textbooks. This is the Oxford Big Ideas, Humanities, and Social Sciences. So, chapter 8. The youngest. I gotta go back and do the oldest start, youngest end, and oldest end. But here you see 8,000 to 2,700. There's quite a bit of difference between all these different dates that have been attributed to the pre-dynastic period. The early dynastic period has quite a few different dates attributed to it as well, sometimes varying by 2950. Yeah, by the biggest difference is 225 years. That's a lot of time. But I was going to bring that up earlier with the differences in Egyptian chronology and how even today we still don't really have a solid grasp on the differences there. So here's the very end of this chapter 3, Epics. The third foundation of chronology is drawn from certain constant epics which none of the chronologers and historians ever called in question. Those fixed points in chronology are like firm places where one may stand and consider upwards and downwards the more slippery and dark passages of history. We have here set down 29 of those fundamental points which most chronologers agree upon with the relation to the years of the Julian period and those that preceded the birth of our Savior. I have borrowed them from Father Petavius, a Jesuit, a famous chronologer, which obliges me, in imitation of that learned man, to range those 29 epics by the years of the Julian period, that we may use them as a common, assured, and standing rule to direct us in the dark places of chronology. So these are the 29 points: the sabbatical years of the Jews, the beginning of the Olympiads, the building of Rome, which these are dated 776, 753, the era of Nabonassar, which is 747. Cyrus lays the foundation of the Persian monarchy. Cambyses, Cyrus's son, began to reign. Darius, Hystaspes' son, began to reign. Sea fight betwixt Xerxes and the Grecians near Salamina, and so on and so forth. The death of Alexander the Great is supposedly most chronologers agree upon. Reading back on this again, I'm a bit confused as to why he would word it this way, because he says none of the chronologers and historians ever called in question these events, and then he's like, well, most of them agree upon it, which means that a minority don't. I don't know what to make of that, but maybe with more thought, just let me know what you think in the comments, to tell me your opinion on what that might mean. Here's more points of certainty: the era of Spain, the Battle of Actium, the Egyptians began their era, the Vulgar era, which the Vulgar era, or the birth of Jesus Christ, beginning on the calends, or first day of January, the middle of the 4th year of the 194th Olympiad. So that is dated based on the Greek record there, Greek calendar. The death of Caesar Augustus. Claudius succeeds Caligula. Nero reigns after Claudius. Death of Domitian. The Council of Nicaea. The flight of the false prophet Muhammad. So these are the 29 points of certainty which we can use as reference points to look into other parts of history, which I wonder just how certain all of those are. What kind of information or evidence do we have for the beginning of the Olympiads? How do we know for certain, or how do we know with a high rate of confidence that they did start in 776? So yeah, that is chapter 2 of Ductor historicus, written in 1698, if I'm not mistaken. I did mention it at the beginning of the video. So it's a pretty big book. I'm not going to read all of it on the live stream, because like some of this stuff I think is just the talking about the rule durations. Yeah, see, this is a really short chapter where it just says basically the main events. You know, this guy lived here, this guy lived here. It's kind of interesting to me a bit how they split these up by years of fives. They're all multiples of fives except for the Olympic Games. So they just happen to live during this time. It doesn't give any more information about when they were born or when they died or what else they did there. But I think it is just supposed to be a short introduction to history, so it's not supposed to have all that information. Maybe, I don't know which one I'm going to do next, but maybe if you guys look at this, comment on it and tell me which one you want to hear next, and I will read through it on a live stream and talk about some of my opinions on it and what I think. So that concludes the chapter 2, and I thank everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this, be sure to check out the Ctruth Patreon to get access to more of these activities, the live streams, and just see what the Patreon has. If you aren't interested in Patreon but you do want to donate, I've got donate links in the description to this video. I've got the link to the website if you want to go check out the website and see what I've got up on there. Other than that, this